All work and no play makes me a dull boy. It has been a fairly grueling 2 weeks since I saw you last, mainly concentrating on getting the Vogue rolling so that we can get it out of here, because in 2 weeks time we need to be out of here. So what I've been doing is coming for a day's work and not leaving without taking stuff with me. So all that's left are really the two cars, the parts that came off them, the big parts, and the tools. There is a plan, it will unfold. But what we have this time is a very Land Rover centric episode, which we're overdue. I don't think we've had a proper Land Rover episode yet, so that's to come, but let's get straight into it with the work on the Vogue. Okay, I couldn't put this off any longer. Because we couldn't paint the whole chassis, I had to figure out where was going to be the cutoff point, prep that, and then get it painted. And I think it's going to be this outrigger. Anything after this, we're going to peel back and repaint. After this outrigger is where the rear wheel would throw up all the water and stones and stuff. So the chassis has suffered most just here. Now the first thing I'm going to do is pull off the bump stop and then the shock mount, just so that we can clean up behind them. And I go at the chassis with a scraper, just a normal paint scraper, to get the bulk of the underseal off first, and then we can continue prepping. But this I thought was a good way. And you see there's rust here, and some people would tell you that, oh, they wouldn't use underseal because there's always rust behind it. Well, there isn't. You've got to remember, this car is 27 years old. If this rust had been there the whole time, we'd actually be uncovering holes here. So the next thing is I'm pulling off the fuel filter just so we can clean up underneath it. And just on this section of chassis, there is a little bit of a problem. I have fixed it on the near side. I didn't film that because genuinely I didn't think we were going to be seeing this much of the chassis. And in the interest of time, we're not going to film it on the off side either. It's a simple repair like we've done before, and we need to keep going. Now once I'd scraped everything off, I went back over the chassis with a knotted wire wheel on the grinder, and this really cleaned it up. But I will prepare the chassis one last time with maybe wire wool and maybe a solvent just to degrease it before we paint. So the near side gets exactly the same treatment off of the bump stop, clean everything up roughly, and then go back over it with the grinder and the wire wheel. Now what I did here when we started to create dust was I covered the whole car in this plastic that you can get from your paint supply shop or maybe a decent motor factors, and I put the Hoover inside to create a vacuum, and you can see it worked really well. It was such a massive help. Now the next thing to tackle was the axle. It needed the same preparation, so what I did was I built a kind of a makeshift blast chamber with some pallets and more of this plastic, and again I had the Hoover stuck in here. It was not a pleasant place to be. Rest assured I was wearing full overalls, a respirator, goggles, masks and ear defenders, the whole lot. It still really wasn't nice, but it was time to get this chassis prepped. Now we have a few things left on the chassis, some will stay, some won't. What you're looking at here are the connections for the brake wear warning light on the dash that go onto just one caliper on the rear axle. I've managed to rip them out, but we will replace them. And this is the ABS sensor on one side. I will leave that in, but we will clean it up. Now here's that double layer of gasket sealant that somebody put on the diff gasket. That again will be getting peeled out of there and replaced. The diff itself shows signs of a weep. This kind of oily mess around the nose of the diff is where the bearing has actually been compromised and in turn has compromised the input seal. That is something we can replace later on. It isn't terrible for now, but we'll have to clean it up. So I continued cleaning the axle with the wire wheel, the knotted wire wheel, and I just used it to get in anywhere it would reach. And we can go back over this by hand or with the power file, anything that will get into the nooks and crannies. Now on one end, the hub is showing signs of a weep. This is probably from the seal in the hub. It could though conceivably be from a shock absorber that let go. But again, this is something that we can investigate at a later date. It will be easier to see as well when the chassis is painted, whether it's an ongoing problem or whether it's the legacy from a previous problem. So there was just a few more bits and pieces on the axle to clean up. This did take quite some time because the axle is obviously full of little nooks and crannies. And then I turned my attention to the leaks on the diff pan welds, and I ground it back. Now, we had, I think, 10 leaks from the original welds when I tested it. There were 10 places where it was leaking. Now before I went to weld up those leaks again, there were a few little areas in the axle I hadn't quite gotten to, and I hit those so that we were working as cleanly as possible. Some of the leaks I could visibly see where they were coming from when I ground it back, some weren't so apparent. So back up on axle stands, and I welded in where I knew we had issues. And these welds did not go well at all. I wasn't getting the penetration I wanted. The welder was acting up in terms of the wire feed, and it just, I knew straight away this was not going to be much of a job. And somebody warned me that I would be chasing pinholes for ages, and sure enough, we went from having 10 leaks to having 18, which was incredibly disheartening. But I wasn't giving up. And you might ask, well, why did you do this when people warned you off it? Well, I want to learn. And it's as simple as that. I'm probably very stubborn too. You know, taking the easy route every time doesn't necessarily get you any skills. It might save you time, but you haven't added to your arsenal of knowledge and abilities. So once again, with difficulty, I pulled the diff back off the axle so that we could test again with some fuel. And on the fuel front, you may have been thinking, well, fuel, flammable when you're welding. I knew I wasn't going to be going back to welding this for at least a couple of days. I left it dry and ventilated so that any last little dregs of fuel could evaporate. Obviously, you need to be very careful where you're using neat fuel. Now, like I say, we upped the number rather than reducing the number of leaks in this welding job, and it looks worse than ever. But I wasn't going to give up. And having marked it up a second time, I went at it with the welder. And this time I concentrated very, very hard. Not that I hadn't before, but I tried to do everything as conscientiously as possible to give myself the best chance. Because this was really starting to dig into the time left we have in the unit and the time we have to get this vehicle prepped and rolling. So with a third test, lo and behold, we reduced the number of leaks from 18 to 5. And I was much happier about that. More so, it was very obvious where these 5 leaks were coming from, so I knew exactly where I needed to be welding, whereas in previous attempts there were always a few that I wasn't quite sure, and you were just going over an area hoping to get it in the right place. Now, the story I'm going to tell you is that at this point I flipped the axle over again and tested it by pouring fuel in. Alright, I didn't test it, but you know what? For the first time I felt I've got to keep moving here. So I went and I checked the specs of the paint that we're using, this kind of rust paint. And it is fuel and oil proof, not resistant, proof. So I decided I would take a leap of faith that hopefully I have sealed these 5 leaks. So I did a final prep over the whole axle. I pulled off the breather, which was the only thing that was still on it that needed to come off. Cleaned up the last few little bits. I degreased it, and then the axle was ready to paint. And I did paint it. And I have to say, after many days, fairly grueling and dirty work, it was great to see this thing turning a nice, even, uniform colour. Even if that isn't the colour I'd like, I'm not driving around with a silver axle. We will do a top coat of black on this. So, over to the chassis and the same deal. And it took quite a long time to paint this, because again there are lots of nooks and crannies, and this paint, rather than being the type of paint that kind of fills itself in, if you miss a little bit a brush stroke will kind of flatten out, this thing seems to recede slightly. Maybe I hadn't prepped properly, but I was trying to be as conscientious with my prep work as possible. But I felt that you'd come back and find places that had little nicks or bits you'd missed when I was fairly sure I hadn't missed anything. Anyway, this all got second coats the next day. It's very subtle, you're not going to really be able to see it happening. And once this has a little bit of time to cure, we are ready for a top coat. With all that done, I turned my attention to all the little bits and pieces that I pulled off the axle and the chassis. So we have brackets for the wiring, we have the shock mounts, spring seats and spring retaining plates, and the brake shields. So we now have a pile of ancillary parts that are going to need to be painted too, but I turned my attention to the diff. Now this thing, like I said, had been weeping from the input bearing, so I degreased it before I dried it down, made sure it was completely clean and dry, and then painted that too. It's not an immaculate job by any means, but it's not bad. And what we need to do with this diff is clean the inside of it, the crown wheel and everything in there, to make sure we haven't gotten any swarf. We have been very careful, by the way, but just to be conscientious, it needs a good old once over. And that was all the time I had for the Vogue this time. But never fear, dear viewer, because looming into view are our piano frames for the sheet metal brake stand. Now what I have here also are 4 pieces of, I think, 33mm outer diameter tubing, and the ends of these weren't quite square, so I got the chop saw out and trued them up as best I could, because we're going to use these to try and tie together the piano frames to make this stand. The next thing I did was I got some washers, and I intentionally bought washers bigger than the tube so that they could be ground back later on, and I welded to them some M6 nuts, because this setup is going to be welded onto the ends of the tubing to make captive nuts in the tubing so we can bolt everything together. In hindsight, I'd like to replace these with M10s or M12s, because the piano frames will take them A, but B, they'll just be a hell of a lot stronger. So here are 4 of these little captive nut washers. And here is our gnarly old vise that came with the drill press, which has been coming in very handy for welding on the floor. So I offered up the washers and just tacked them into these tubes. It was tricky enough to get these centered. They're probably not perfect, but they're not far off. And we'll clean them up later on. Now the bolt that you saw I was using just to offer them up, I took the head off it because we need some threaded bar for certain sections of this. You'll see that going in later on. I turned my attention to the third frame, which you'll have noticed there is a third frame now. I hadn't cut it in the first place because I hoped we'd get away with 2, but it became very apparent that we'd need the sturdiness of 3 frames. But it had fallen when the piano burned and cracked, and some pieces had got knocked off it. Now, Sean the blacksmith had warned me that it's difficult to get a decent job welding cast iron, and my setup wasn't going to be ideal for it. You would need to really preheat all of this stuff at least, and have the right electrodes on, probably a stick welder to do this nicely. You can see my welds are sitting up on top. It's not great, but I wanted to have a go. Like I say, every little thing you do is a bit of experience, even if it's not right. And for now, we notionally have a frame that's in one piece. Now 2 of these frames at their top edge, which will essentially be the bed for the sheet metal brake, have these little ridges on them, and one of them doesn't. So I'm going to put that one in the middle and the other 2 on the outside so that they're out of the way. I'd rather not have to cut them off, but you'll see that in a minute. So with the bars coming into play, I'm able to bolt these frames together. And this is just a fit up. This is not the final fix on this thing. I'm not using washers. Like I say, I'd like these fasteners to be larger, and I'm instantly not in love with the tubes. I thought in my mind's eye that they would work with the kind of curved lines of the frames, but it's just not right. And what I think I want to do is try and scavenge some more pieces of piano frame and use them with brackets to bolt all of this together, so that essentially, apart from the actual sheet metal brake itself, the stand is all piano frame, cast iron. It'll help weight wise too. I figure that what we have here, I'm going to weigh one of these piano frames, but I'm guessing we have maybe 100 kilos here without the sheet metal brake sitting on top, and that might be another 30 or 40 kilos. But in case this thing started to lift when we were folding a piece of metal, I'd like to put some kind of a step on the front of it so that we'd somewhere to put our foot and hold it down physically. The other thing I'd like to do is repeat our simple Art Deco pattern in the bottom of these legs, just to make it a bit prettier. Although I do quite like it as it is, and we could just put a right angle step with some angle iron and save ourselves some trouble. But hey, you know, good things take a little bit of work. Now here are those bed legs, they're kind of like a fence, but you see you've got this kind of rib, which could be problematic. We'll have to see when we fit up the sheet metal brake. That is as far as we got this time. I did throw the brake onto it just to see. This is just sitting there kind of precariously, but is this thing not very cool? I really think this is good. We do need to build some kind of bracing for the clamping jaw. We also obviously have to build the handle, and don't forget we have those beautiful brass dog bone radiator caps to go on the bolts at the end too. So we've a bit more work to do, but we're almost there. I've been saying this, I know I've been saying this, but I'm so excited to finish that thing. Even if it turns out to be just a massive doorstop, I would be very happy to stop at my door with it. I'm proud of what it is so far, and I think it's something cool. I love making stuff like that. So we're gonna see what happens in the coming episodes. Now, before we go into an interview, I wanna show you a few cars. Tom Childs has a Peugeot GTI 6, and that's a car. There are many cars now that it's kind of a grey area. Are they modern classics? But I think this is something that really defines what a modern classic is. It's got that kind of curio factor. It's cool, it performs well, and it's from a company who gave us some great cars. But the other thing that Tom has is a BMW 535i Sport. Now, this particular car was ordered by the managing director of a dealership very close to Tom back in the day, as a kind of a show car, tip of the hat to the AC Silhouette, which was the rage back then. So it has some of the styling cues of the Silhouette, but Tom reckons that it's more in the looks department than in the performance. I don't know, it's a 535, so it can't be much of a slouch. Tom, I hope you get your work done soon. I hope it's back on the road for you and you get many miles of happy motoring from it. So keep it up. The next person is Colin Owens, and Colin has something that I can only describe as insane. It is a twin-engined, twin-turbocharged, twin-supercharged Volvo 850. It seems to be a creation of Colin's. I haven't spoken to him at length about it yet, but I think we're going to have to, at least get some more information, whether it's second party or in person, from Colin on this car. And I'm going to put some links in the description, because there's some videos of it doing hill climbs and burnouts and generally being the nuts thing that it is. So Colin, thanks for sending it, and yeah, just really, really fun, really cool. The person though, just by pure show of solidarity, that I want to send the Valet Pro kit to is Jeroen Minderman, and Jeroen has a Mitsubishi Delica. Now, I looked that up because I'm always interested in kind of languages and the etymology of words and stuff. Turns out it's English. It's a contraction of delivery car. There you go. But Jeroen obviously saw the trouble that I was having with the rear diff on the Vogue and decided it was time to send me a few photographs, because Jeroen's rear diff was also leaking. Listen to this video. I felt that sigh. I felt that sigh firsthand, and it's not pleasant. Jeroen, I hope that your repair lasts, pal. I'm not sure it's a sub-sanctioned repair, but hey, you get by, you do what you can. I actually thought of buying one of these Delicas when I was first surfing, and I ended up with Land Rovers. But there you go. Speaking of Land Rovers though, we are going now to revisit our man, the guy in the engine department of Jaguar Land Rover, Richard Gosling, and he's going to talk to us about Land Rovers. This one I think is just proper interesting. I really thought this was great, so I hope you do too.
Well, I'm working on engines generally. It's the same range of engines goes into the Jaguar and the Land Rover products. This is why I got the job there, is that they're desperately busy on engine side at the moment. Having been owned by Ford in the past, at that point they just borrowed engines from the Ford family. When they left, they felt, we're going to be a world-class company, need to have our own range of engines. And so from a standing start, they're going to make 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, diesel, petrol, 2-litre, 3-litre versions, all to an extent related. There's trying to get as much commonality across them as possible, but it's a huge task to get all of those engines up. And the 4-cylinder diesel and petrol are already in the market. The 6-cylinders are going to be out very soon, but we're already looking at the sort of the midlife updates to the 4-cylinders, even though we haven't even got the first range of the 6-cylinders out there. So that the pressure of the work that's going on there is pretty intense. But there's different variants. So even within the 4-cylinder family, there's low output, medium output, high output, different ranges of different amounts of turbocharging on them. So although the fundamental engine is the same, what you'll get will be suited to the product you're buying, whether it's Land Rover or Jaguar or as a saloon car or a sports car.
What are those engines called?
Ingenium, that's the name of the range, yeah.
And what would you say is their key attribute?
I think it's we're really pushing for lightweight. Jaguar and Land Rover have been pushing for this aluminium intensive architecture to make the vehicles lighter. It's the same with the engines, that they're going for lightweight as much as possible. That's where a lot of the stuff I'm doing comes in. It's trying to reduce the weight of the components so that they're as strong as they need to be, but don't have any surplus weight. We're trying to trim 20 grams here, 50 grams there, and any bit that comes off is good. But the other feature is trying to get as much commonality across the whole range as possible, which is a lot trickier than you think it's going to be when you've got so many variants. I think last count, off the top of my head, there are at least sort of 20, 25 variants within the range of engines on different sizes, and then there's different markets. So you can't make it as common as you'd like to, but that's the focus of trying to do it as much as possible.
So I'm really interested in the weight thing, obviously for the Lotus reasons, but I mean, so the big companies are still very, very, they cast an eye to even as little as 20 grams here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Jaguar in particular has always been known for producing, even their saloon cars have always had that sporty edge, and so they're bringing the weight down for that point of view. But also, the challenge these days actually is just meeting the legislative requirements for emissions, for fuel economy, and you have to do this as an average across the fleet of the cars, and that's easier if you're a manufacturer of small cars, because mostly your cars are going to be economical. If you're only producing premium cars, you've still got to meet the same average fuel consumption as Fiat are. And so it's an even harder push to try and make these large, comfortable premium cars as economical and low emission as they can be. And it's a stated principle of Jaguar Land Rover that they're not going to try and meet the targets simply by encouraging people to buy the smaller, lighter cars. We want people to buy the car they want. So we're not jiggling the prices to try and push people towards the cars that will help us pass the emissions. No, the aim is to make sure that we can do that with whatever mix of cars people buy.
So the weight is a big thing.
It really is, yeah. And it's good to see that. It's, in a way, it's kind of going back to the principles of Lotus again, of Colin Chapman's principles to try and keep the weight down. And I imagine this is happening across the other companies in a similar position, BMW, Audi, although they're still mainly using steel bodies, whereas Jaguar is using aluminium and have been for a few years now, which should put us a little bit ahead.
Will there be another Defender?
There's definitely a plan for another Defender. That's no secret. When it's going to happen, I really don't know any more than anyone else does. There have been spy shots and mock-ups in some of the magazines, and I can say those are entirely speculative. Those are just in the feverish minds of the journalists who have sketched them up. I don't know what the product's going to look like, and I don't know when it's going to come out. I'm interested to see what they will come up with. I really want to see a product that stays true to the principles of where Land Rover started, you know, even if it's not going to be the product that makes the company the most money, I think it's important they have a product that really is authentic to what Land Rover should be standing for, that reminds people what a Land Rover represents. And I think they will be able to come up with something that will do that. In terms of the technology, you know, even most of the Land Rovers now can do things that the early series Land Rovers couldn't dream of doing, with, you know, with the electronic controls over the brakes and hill descent control and all these tricks. You know, you can do things. The off-road capability is getting better and better. So it may really just sort of come down to what the vehicle looks like and that sense of toughness and determination.
Do you think there's an argument to the people who think it's kind of pointless to have a machine that's just better and better off-road when nobody is willing to take it off-road?
I think for most manufacturers who are building SUVs, that is true. I think for Land Rover, it is essential that they retain that genuine capability, otherwise they lose what makes them Land Rover. And with the products they're producing now, even within the Range Rover range, which are obviously aimed much more at the luxury market, you know, they still use these vehicles on horrendous expeditions going over mountains and across deserts and stuff. You know, we occasionally get newsletters sent around at work showing expeditions that the vehicles have been on, so they still have that capability. They are absolutely capable of it, but generally they're not used for that anymore. And yeah, it is kind of pointless in a way, but that is what the market is out there for. And you know, a company like Jaguar Land Rover, they're going to sell what the market wants, the same as anyone does.
Just as a car guy, what would you like to see the new Defender being?
I think it needs to be something that, from the moment you look at it, do you think this is a vehicle that means business and its primary purpose is to be able to climb mountains? And it will need to be something that the series and Defender Land Rovers weren't, in that it needs to be quite capable of going on a motorway at 70 miles an hour for a long distance in some comfort. You know, people will expect that even of a Defender these days, but you look at it and you're going to see it's going to have high ground clearance, it's going to have really, really short overhangs. It'd be nice if they retained some of the boxy look of the original. And it'd be interesting if that's what they go for, it'd be interesting to see how they do that, because where that's been done recently with the new Beetle, with the new London Taxi, with the Mini, it's a very fine line between homage and pastiche, and it's a very tricky thing to do. The current range has a very much a current look about it, which the designer Jerry McGovern has come up with. And that doesn't really look like an old Land Rover. So it'll be interesting to see what he comes up with. But I do hope that it has, because you look at a Land Rover, you know, my 2-year-old son will see a Land Rover from 500 yards away and he'll point to it and say Land Rover. He knows exactly what it is, and that's would be something that the new vehicle would have, I would hope.
It's safe to say, as a finite elements analyst, you will have some responsibility yourself for making sure that it's tough.
Yes, you know, I work entirely on the engine side of things, but that absolutely is part of what we do. You know, we have issues like, you know, we need to make sure that if the vehicle, one of the things I've been working on recently is engine mounts, and they have to survive what we call the ditch drop test, which basically means you drive over a ledge, smash down into a ditch, and the engine mounts need to be strong enough to survive that. Most vehicles, including most SUVs, that's not something they consider. So it is designed to be tough in every component and to survive these fairly brutal treatment.
I'm interviewing your dad. Do you want to go and help him? Okay, you go and sit in.
You want to come and sit with me?
Oh, you're just going to watch.
You're
Okay.
gonna watch.
You have to watch quietly though, okay?
You'll be very quiet.
Be very quiet. Did you just say that the most manufacturers of SUVs don't consider that test?
To my knowledge, I don't think they do. Jaguar Land Rover do obviously check their competitors' vehicles, like everyone does. They buy a vehicle from a competitor and pull it apart. And I don't know everything about what they find in these things, but without going into details, which I obviously can't go into, there are certainly a couple of areas I'm aware of that a competitor vehicle would not meet our requirements. I couldn't say who it was and I couldn't say where it was because I'm sworn to secrecy by the company, but...
It's really interesting. So, yeah. So basically you are, Jaguar Land Rover are I suppose safe in the knowledge that they're doing stuff better.
Yeah, absolutely. And, aside from Jeep, Land Rover were the original off-roaders. Land Rover invented the concept of the luxury off-roader with the original Range Rover. And so, we defined the genre and we want to stay ahead of the game, make sure that the company still does define the genre.
Okay, so you have a story.
Yeah, so this was back when I was maybe about 3 years old or so, and we lived on a farm. My grandparents lived on the main farmhouse as well, and they had an old, either a Series 2B or a Series 3 station wagon. And my cousin was visiting as well at the time, and he injured himself, needed to go off to hospital urgently. The only vehicle around that my mother could nab was the Land Rover, so we all piled into that. She got into it and she turned the key and it wouldn't start. She didn't know how to start it. And then up pipes this little voice from the back seat. It's like, you press that button there. So age 3, I already knew the starting procedure for a Series 3 or Series 2A, 2B Land Rover, which my mother had no idea how to get going.
How come we don't have one?
Heather's been very keen on us getting one, actually. I'd love to have one, but I don't really have the space or the budget at the moment. And if and when, for any reason, my life returns to farming, then that will certainly be the first thing we get.
I feel very privileged to be able to have a chat with a man deep in the motor industry like that. Even if it's not the company line, I think someone like Richard is just so interesting to listen to, and it's really a great thing. I'm very, very happy. The other thing is Richard is finally back on the road in his Lotus XL. He sent me some photos that he said he hurriedly took for the insurance valuation. What a unique car, really, really cool. Richard, I'm so glad you're back and the family gets to have fun in it again. Okay. In episode 18, I talked about the last Lotus Europa ever built, and I said, hey, if you know anything about this car, get in touch. Well, a very cool thing happened. A man called Jeff, a viewer of Soup, was at a wedding where he met a man called Alan, who he knew had at some point had a Lotus Europa, and he said, hey, they're looking for this last Lotus Europa, and Alan was the guy that Chris Trickett, who we know owned the car, sold it to back in the day. Alan had it for almost 10, 11 years, did some restoration work on it and made money back selling it in the mid-80s to a fella who we know the name of, but we'll respect his privacy for now, but who was in the Southport area of the UK. So if you know anything about this car, get in touch. As I said before, it had a plaque in the center console that Chris put in it to commemorate the fact that it was the last Europa ever built. By the way, it was silver and not yellow, as I mistakenly pointed out in episode 18, but silver wasn't the Europa colour. This car was ordered as the last Europa by the sales director of Lotus, and it was sold to Chris through Len Street, which was a famous Lotus dealer in Chelsea. It also had daytime federal spec amber running lights on the body, so it's very recognisable, and you can see the plaque in the photographs. Anyway, if you know anything about it, let us know. It's just curiosity. Some guy is reminiscing about their old car and they'd love to know what happened to it. And that got me thinking, because you do see this and people post on forums looking for their old cars, the one that got away. And I've been contacted by other people. So I thought, if you are trying to track down a car, I am more than happy to give shout outs and try and help you track that car down. You know, what good is a platform like this if you can't help people with it? So get in touch if you like. Now, there have been unconfirmed reports of missed notifications, and I definitely noticed a kind of a dip in engagement. Whether that's through the content or not, I'm perfectly willing to accept. But do go and check your subscription status, that the little bell is ticked and that you are set up to get notifications every time a new episode goes up, because it makes a big difference to me, and I would hope it makes a difference to you in the sense that you get to see the episode. Anyway, my patrons: Colin Owen, Erling Alfheim, Josh Fromm, Michael Rayner, Nigel Davies, Steve Adams, Thomas Childs and Anne King. Guys, thank you as much for the belief as for the support. It really does make a huge difference, and I'm very, very grateful. Okay, that's it. Episode 23 done. 24 is going to be exciting, whether that's for better or for worse, because there will be movement. So until I see you then, take care and good luck.